Hello. It's time once again for me to reply to a really hardline creationist who's saying a whole bunch of things that are just completely and horrifically wrong about science and evolution, and even getting religion wrong in places, which is really embarrassing. It bothers me. It bothers me a lot. Also, the presenter and apparently person who put this together is named Kyle Butt, and I'm going to prevent any immature jokes because he didn't pick his name. You know, I just wanted to mention it.
In the year 2002, in Cobb County, Georgia, there was a sticker that was placed on the inside cover of the biology textbooks. That sticker simply said that these textbooks contain information on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, about living organisms, and it should be looked at with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered.
Yep, that sounds like Georgia. Don't know how I feel about that. That seems a little facetious, but let's just press forward.
Do you know, if you were to take the sentiments of that sticker and you were to look at the evidences for evolution with an open mind, and you study them carefully and you critically consider them, what you would find is these evidences don't prove evolution at all.
Well, that's a bold statement. Also, I just adore it. Really. Whenever creationists who are stuck in a literal interpretation of the creation story, the book of Genesis from the Bible, they're just trapped in this, and they're the ones asking everyone else to, well, have an open mind. Really? You want us to have an open mind? That's adorable.
Here are 6 supposed evidences for evolution that simply are not good reasons to believe in evolution. Number 1, vestigial organs. In 1865, a German anatomist named Robert Wiedersheim said that he discovered 185 different useless or virtually useless organs in the body. And he said this was evidence of evolution. In fact, the argument goes that if humans evolved, then they would have had at one time organs that an animal would have used in a certain way, but would no longer be used in that way in the human body, and those organs would begin to atrophy and start to be useless.
This is mostly correct. Vestigial organs do indeed refer to organs or features in most organisms, actually have them, that don't really have a purpose anymore. They're sort of showing gradual evolution. We have a few, like our tailbones. We evolved from apes, and our ape-like ancestors at some point had tails. We don't have tails anymore, but we do have the bone that would have had the tail there, because the bone hasn't quite gotten ruled out. That's why surgically you could remove the tailbone and not really cause any issues when it comes to us. Same thing we said for our wisdom teeth. I had to have my wisdom teeth removed because there's not enough room in our jaw for them anymore, even though at one point there was, and we kind of needed them to help us chew. Now we don't.
The problem with this vestigial organ idea is that there are 2 reasons it cannot prove evolution. Number 1, if you did have vestigial organs in your body, that wouldn't prove evolution. You see, evolution has to go from a single-celled organism to a human, and you don't need organs that are decaying and atrophying. You need evolution to produce new organs. We should find wings that are almost ready to allow organisms to fly that can't yet fly. We should find new visionary optical connections in living organisms that don't have them. We should see things adding information, not losing genetic information.
So already from the get-go, we're showing a patent, just overwhelming misunderstanding of how evolution works, because in certain cases, in fact in many cases, evolution does involve the loss of certain features that are, in fact, useless. You do run into situations where an organism does not necessarily need... Okay, evolution is not like a straight line. It is a wildly varying, branching web of unspeakable chaos. Chaos theory, if you will. Not quite the same. That's a different scientific ethos. But My point is that there are situations where a creature like whales, again, I always bring up the whales, and it annoys me, but at some point, whales lost their legs because they started swimming. They didn't need legs, they needed flippers. So evolutionarily speaking, you can argue that there are times when there are things that are lost. And you might say, well, why would evolution, it's supposed to, you should lose. Why would you lose anything? Well, because you don't need them. We, again, bringing up the tailbone thing, lost our tails at some point. Our ancestors, the species that we were way back in the day, would have had tails. But at some point, we just didn't need the tails anymore. So we stopped having them. Because, for whatever reason, they were not really helpful. They might have made our situation worse in some aspects. For whatever reason, that trait was no longer carried on. Those that had the trait of the tails, or had it more strongly, stopped passing on that particular trait, and it was replaced with something else, or perhaps even replaced with nothing. That sometimes happens, because we didn't need that feature. And you can look inside our bodies and the bodies of other organisms and find certain features that at one point had a purpose, but now no longer do, and they're on the way out because they don't need them.
And the second problem with the vestigial organ argument is that 185 list of vestigial organs, it began to dwindle very rapidly. When we started looking more closely into them, and it became 180, and then 175, and then, do you know, as we look more into the body, we realize that those vestigial organs were very useful. Many of them extremely useful.
Once again, he's only giving you half the information here. It's true that that original 185 figure was kind of an exaggeration, because back in the 1800s when they pointed this out, we didn't have as much of an understanding about our own bodies as we do now. Over time, some of the vestigial organs that were once thought to be vestigial aren't actually as vestigial as we once believed them to be. We actually, as it turned out, kind of needed those. It does happen on occasion where it's realized that, oh, that organ actually does help with some things. We do kind of need that, but that's not true for the whole list. There are things about us that are vestigial. Notice he didn't bring up a tailbone. Notice he didn't bring up wisdom teeth, because that would have defeated his argument, because there are still some traits that are vestigial. Not as many as once thought, sure, but there are still some.
Number two, the idea of homology. We're told that similarity proves ancient ancestry. And what I simply mean by that is we're told that because humans have similar physical characteristics to certain animals, that proves that they evolved from animals.
Well, it's actually more fair to say that humans are also animals. That's what we are. We're a form of life. We're part of Animalia. We're under that umbrella still. Like, what are you trying to say, that we're something else entirely? Admittedly, he may be, because there are some hardline religious people that think humanity is above everything else, and I'm not sure how much I agree with that. But on the basis of pure science here, we did evolve from animals in the sense of we still are animals. Like, we're mammals. Like, that's a basic fact right there.
Well, similarity doesn't prove evolution at all. In fact, you could see things that are similar, and you would realize that those similarities are often caused by a common designer.
Okay, well, you could argue that it's evidence for both, though, and the similarities, yes, okay, I'm going to give him this one. You could say that is evidence that there's a common designer here, that, someone, God, as it were to, came down and he had, knew certain traits worked, and therefore worked certain animals to be rather similar to each other, perhaps, maybe, kind of, sort of. Also, you can see the changes in the fossil record, though, as things changed over time, because certain traits worked, and you can see how certain animals are related to each other by having certain traits. Like again, you're not really understanding what's happening here, and it bothers me. It bothers me that you don't get it, whether by ignorance or a lack of intelligence. I'm not really sure, but I'm going to say ignorance on the basis that I feel like you're just choosing not to get it.
Suppose there were a supernatural intelligent designer and he created a world where many organisms would need to drink the same water, eat the same kinds of food, walk over the same types of terrain. What would happen? Well, obviously, he would use similarities, similar structures to accomplish his goals. Similarity doesn't prove common ancestry. In fact, similarity argues more for a common creator than anything else.
No, it argues for common ancestry too. Like you could say both of those things and it still would be true. Like this really isn't defeating evolution at all. Like just because you say that it argues more for a common creator doesn't make that the case. I mean, yeah, you could suggest that, but it doesn't. It also indicates a common ancestor too because we can see the changes in the fossil record. Like this isn't the gotcha moment that I think you think it is, because no, it's not helping you.
Supposed evidence for evolution number 3, the fossil record.
If you listen real close, I get this ringing in my ear on occasion, and it's usually when I think that someone is about to say something that is going to make me extremely irritated. So, I just wanted to mention it now.
You know what we're told is that you can look into the fossil record and you can find proof that organisms evolved over millions of years. Supposedly, we're told that you can find transformational organisms that prove this animal evolved into some other kind of animal. But if you were to take that seriously and you were to go to the fossil record, what you would find is that those transformational fossils are missing on a grand scale.
They are not. They are not at all. This whole the missing link is still missing argument is thrown around all the time, and it's always disproven in the same way, because we can find transformational fossils. We can find species that are clearly linking other species that are millions of years apart on the geological time scale here. Okay? Like these, and these, and these, and these, and these. Man, just because you say they aren't there doesn't mean they aren't there. They are. You're just not looking for them, or you're ignoring them to make your argument. And that's the frustrating part about this thing for me, is that you are ignoring easily findable information to make your point. And if you have to do that, you're probably not making a very good point.
In fact, evolutionist Mark Ridley stated that no real evolutionist, whether gradualist or punctuationist, uses the fossil record as evidence in favor of the theory of evolution as opposed to special creation. Now, why would he say that?
I had to look up exactly who Mark Ridley was, and I couldn't even find the actual quote. I could not verify that. So he could be making this up, but even if Mark Ridley did say this, I think I know why he said it. Because Ridley studied under Richard Dawkins, and what I imagine is the case is that Ridley said that in order to point out, it was probably a cherry-picked statement where he was basically saying that we don't even need the fossil record to prove evolution. He was probably saying the exact opposite, but you just cherry-picked that one statement to make it look like Ridley was saying that the fossil record isn't good evidence, when in reality, his point was that we don't actually need it to prove it. It is good evidence, but it's not even needed to prove the point.
Well, he would say that because when you look at the fossil record, you see organisms coming into the fossil record fully formed. You see a stage of stasis where they do not change, and then they go out of the fossil record without evolving into anything else.
That's not true. I just showed you a whole bunch of transitional species. Like, you can see it. You're just, again, just choosing... You're giving it like a baby's first fossil introduction here by saying, you know... And yeah, a casual observer might look at the fossil record and say, well, these species never changed. And, like, just because a species was around a really long time and didn't appear to change doesn't mean, A, that it didn't change, and B, doesn't necessarily mean that evolution doesn't exist, because evolution... Yeah, it's a constant effect that can happen over time, but it doesn't happen unless it needs to happen. If a species is successful just the way it is, it's gonna stay just the way it is, because why would it change? Certain traits will continue to be passed on as long as they're continually useful to that species. Sharks are an excellent example of this, because the vast majority of the traits they started with are pretty much the same now. Yeah, they have had certain changes, that's why we have different species of sharks than we did in the past. That's why Megalodon died off, for example. But the point is that traits will continue to be passed on as long as it's useful to a species. And therefore, if situation remains pretty much the same, and that species continues to be successful, the same exact traits will continually be passed on to the generation after, and the generation after, and the generation after, because they continue to be useful, and therefore the species continues to survive and reproduce. That's how evolution works. If something changes, and certain traits are not as effective in terms of survival or helpful for that species, then different traits will get passed on and the species will start to change. That's the most basic way you can explain evolution, and we're talking about billions of years since life first started. Of course, it's changed. Many, many times.
Exactly as the creation model would predict. The fossil record does not prove evolution.
I'm not going to dignify that with a response because I just rebutted all your stupid points. You're wrong. You're just wrong.
Number 4, the idea of mutations. We're told that mutations prove you could get a certain single-celled organism to mutate over multiplied millions of years and bring about new information on a grand scale that, given enough time, you could get a human being. What's the problem with that line of reasoning? The problem is that mutations don't give us new information. Mutations can only take information that is already available and cause it to decay. Mutations are an example of a loss of genetic information.
That's only one definition of the way a mutation works. It's true that a deletion in the DNA sense can cause a gene to mutate and therefore instigate a change. But a mutation could also be a rearrangement of the DNA structure as well, and DNA is a very, very, very ancient substance that goes back to the very beginning of life on this planet. But the point is that a mutation is not just a loss of information, it can also be a rearrangement, and the thing about DNA is that you can rearrange it in so many different ways, to do so many different things, and that results in a wide, insane array of different ways that life can be structured.
Let me give you an example. For the last 100 years or more now, scientists have been studying fruit flies. They are great examples of how you can mutate an organism. We have been zapping these fruit flies with radiation and mutating them in chemical ways for more than 100 years now. The reason that they are so valuable to study is because you can get a new generation every 14 days. We have in that 100-year period the equivalent of what would be millions of years of evolutionary time. And what do you have after all the radiation and mutation? Do you have a fruit fly that has evolved new genetic information? No, you don't. In fact, all you still have is a fruit fly. It hasn't evolved into anything else. Mutations don't prove evolution. That's simply not the mechanism that could get a single-celled organism to a human.
Okay, first of all, your time scale is completely out of whack here, because assuming that the generational thing was going on for that 100 years, and it's really that simple, and you're saying, oh, that's 1,000,000 years, and that's a long time. Yeah, to us. But geologically, evolutionarily, 1,000,000 years is nothing. Absolutely nothing. Okay, it means nothing in the grand scheme of things. And, like, you're ignoring these fruit fly experiments and the fact that they are showing changes, they are showing mutations, they are showing that changes are happening to these flies that we can actually see in real time. Additionally, a generation of a fruit fly, because they reproduce so fast, also means that there's less changes going on around them. Like, yeah, scientists can hit them with radiation and instigate certain changes if they want to, but it's kind of hard to replicate the real world, a real world change that, instigates a survival, protocol, evolutionarily speaking, I guess you could call it, in a lab. It's hard, it's not an easy thing to duplicate. Taking this from a, religious perspective, it's hard to recreate God's planet in a laboratory and show the process of evolution that, that was put into place billions of years ago. And I guess what he wants is for these flies to magically evolve into, like, a human at some point, and that's not how this friggin' works. And when you're talking about single cell to humans, you are talking about at least, at minimum, 4 billion years, and I can't overstate how long an amount of time that is for all these changes to take place, for all these different things to happen, for all these cataclysms to completely wipe certain life off the planet repeatedly, multiple times. And at some point, yeah, we got to us, but it was a long road that can't just easily be magicked up in a laboratory and we can say, look here, we just made a person out of a fruit fly. That's not how this happens, okay?
Number 5, English peppered moths. We're told that English peppered moths provide an example of evolution in action. You see, before the Industrial Revolution, there were 2 varieties of English peppered moths. One dark-colored, one light-colored, but the light-colored was much higher in ratio than the dark-colored. But after the Industrial Revolution, the dark-colored became the more prominent color and the light, the fewer in the mix. And we're told that's because birds could see the light-colored better, etc. And this was supposedly an example of natural selection. The problem with this example is, number one, many of the pictures were faked because the English peppered moths don't often land on tree trunks, and the entire idea was flawed in that way. But the second problem was that before the Industrial Revolution, the genetic information in the English peppered moth genome had genetic information for 2 varieties, light-colored and dark-colored, and after, the genetic information was the same. English peppered moths simply do not prove evolution.
Yeah, but based on your own explanation, the genetic information wasn't the same. Because, yeah, they were still the same species of moth, but they had a trait that made them darker. That's literally what you said. So they're not genetically the same. At all. Well, I mean, they have some similarities, obviously. They're still the same species, but they have a different trait. Additionally, I looked into this particular thing he's saying that isn't true when it comes to the landing on the trees thing and all that, and saying that, oh, this entire thing was flawed. And the original study that was done on the English peppered moths was indeed called out as being somewhat flawed, scientifically speaking. As there were some holes even pointed out by actual scientists. What he doesn't bring up is that the study was repeated in a much better way in the early 2000s. And guess what? They still wound up with the same conclusions, that the dark-colored moths were favored evolutionarily because it was harder to see them in a post-industrialized world by birds. That's the way it happened, and it makes sense. Things were darker because there was more pollution. Therefore, the darker moths blended into things. And it wasn't always the trees either. And just because they don't generally land on trees doesn't mean they don't land on trees, because they do sometimes. Okay?
And number 6, horse evolution. If you were to look in your biology textbooks, you would see that horse evolution is often used as evidence that evolution really occurred. You would see a picture of a very small animal, almost looks like a fox or something like that, evolving into modern horse. But this scenario, it's fabricated. It's not true. It was made up. In fact, more than 50 years ago, Dr. George Gaylord Simpson said the uniform continuous transformation of Hyracotherium into Equus, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers, never happened in nature.
Okay, I looked into this some more, and I'm not really sure where he's getting his information from. He probably made it up, if I had to guess. But even if there was an issue with the simplification of one species becoming the horse eventually, or finding out that perhaps that ancient species only looked like a horse, but wasn't necessarily an ancestor, which does happen sometimes in science, doesn't mean that horses didn't evolve. Maybe the interpretation of the line was wrong in the past. That has occurred plenty of times. I mean, there was a time when we thought dinosaurs were, ancestors of reptiles or something, when in reality, they're not. They're ancestors of birds. As more information comes to us about the past and how things have changed, we can get a clearer picture of how life evolved. And we're not always right in our interpretations. It does happen. But it doesn't just magically disprove the whole thing, just because this one species line happened to have a bit of a hiccup with it at some point. I mean, okay, yeah, even if what he's saying is correct, that just means we need to do more research and figure it out where we went wrong, which it seems like has been done. It doesn't mean that the entire theory of evolution is wrong. It just means this one species was somewhat misunderstood.
You see, this information that's presented to us as proof that evolution actually occurred is not proof at all. If we look at it with an open mind and we study it carefully and we critically consider it, we'll realize that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth and all of the organisms, and evolution just simply didn't play any part in God's creation.
I find that I repeat myself a lot in these videos, but I'm going to do it again. You realize it's easily possible to say that there is still a God and for evolution to be a thing. Like, that's doable, right? So the issue is not really with the disapproval of God. The issue is the disapproval of the literal interpretation of the creation story in the Old Testament of the Bible, as it is in the Torah as well, as I believe it is also in the Quran. The story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and God creating everything in 7 days, that's the problem. It's not, like, the issue, because the issue is not God himself. Because you can sit there, I am going to sit here and say that I believe that there is a God. But I also believe in science, and I also believe that evolution is a thing. And I believe that God was smart enough and intelligent enough, as a divine being, to create a world that, in the infinite chaos of the universe, would in fact be subject to change and able to adapt to said change. Because we can look around us and see that this world is ever-changing, but it always balances itself out in the end, because that's the remarkable element of life. You can say that there was an intelligent designer behind this, and not deny how it all works, because you want to cling to the literal interpretation of the story. And you go around and throw all these just flat-out wrong statements at actual intelligent people who've actually studied this, who've actually figured out how the world works. And to me, it would almost annoy me, from my interpretation, I would imagine that God would be kind of annoyed by that, because what scientists are effectively doing is looking into and figuring out how the world that he created actually works. And therefore, as a good parent, as God is good, and we are all his children, he would want us to figure out as much as we can about the universe that he created, and learn more and uplift ourselves. He wants to see us, spread our wings and fly. Maybe even literally. We'll evolve into birds at some point. I don't know. But my point is that the notion of locking ourselves into this rigid structure that can never at any point alter. Look, the world changes. We can see it just in our own species. Societies change. Empires rise and fall. The world hasn't remained a static exhibit. Even in our own history as a species, the world has gone through multiple cataclysmic changes, multiple, ridiculous things that have happened, insane moments of unspeakable chaos. Earthquakes and typhoons and tsunamis that have completely uprooted entire species, and our own included. And over the course of the billions of years the Earth has been here, that has happened a lot. Sometimes even worse than we've seen as a species. Talk to the dinosaurs. The meteor didn't go so well for them. You can see it. We can see it. We can see the evidence, and I would think that God, again, as a good parent, would want us to see it and want us to learn more about why we're here and, about the world. Why wouldn't he? But you didn't think about that, because dogma is the goal, apparently. But, yeah. So, this was fun. Every time I do this, I lose more brain cells, but it was fun. And before I go, special thank you to both my apex predators, Dr. Racer78 and Arthur Roy. Till next time, guys, this is Darkness, and a bid you all a fond farewell.